Hey everybody, welcome to the Get Healthy webinar where we bring you our favorite brands and partnerships right here once a month so that we can talk real, important clinical application of products that are going to scale your business and also give you incredible clinical outcomes with your patients. Today, we're talking about a really hot topic, clinical strategy for integrating SiPore, which is a product on our catalog throughout the metabolic peptide journey. Whether people are just starting a metabolic peptide, they need support while they're using it, or if they're trying to get off a metabolic peptide, let's find out today where SiPore can fit in that journey. So, with me today is Alexis Gonzalez. She is a naturopathic doctor, but she's also the senior clinical and AI specialist at Ovation Lab. She is here on behalf of Sigrid, and she's going to be talking to us today about how to implement this strategy. I'm super excited to have you here, Lexi. I've been waiting for this one because this is true to my heart. We use a lot of metabolic peptides in my clinic, and I know a lot of our practitioners do, but the questions come up. And I was introduced to this brand probably, 2 years ago. A lot of growth in the company. So I'm excited to hear from you because you are an ND and you use this in application. So thanks for being here. Thanks for being part of the Get Healthy webinar series.
Thank you so much for having me and super excited to bring this new tool to your audience and really for you all and watching today to bring this new tool to your patients. As Dr. Stroop mentioned, metabolic peptides are prevalent in a lot of our practices. So the more tools and strategies that we can add into our toolbox to support our patients along this journey, the better. So really super excited to be with you all this morning, afternoon.
Great. Well, yeah, whatever time zone you're in, we're excited. So before we get into Lexi's PowerPoint, she's going to share and go over some really great information. Just remember, there's an open Q&A. You can put your questions in there. We'll address these at the end of the webinar. There's also a chat where we'll pop some links for you if needed. So Lexi, I'm going to go dark. I'm going to let you share your screen. And thanks again.
Thank you. Let's go ahead and get started here. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes, looks great. Thank you.
Awesome. All right. So we're here today to talk about the metabolic peptide journey, and we're going to hone in on a new tool and really a new category of tools to support your patients along this journey. So Dr. Stroop mentioned this tool really fits along, patients who are interested in starting metabolic peptides as they initiate throughout their journey using the metabolic peptide, and definitely for having that offboarding plan for how you maintain those results afterwards. So the strategy is really focused on supporting patients along this entire journey. And when we think about patients that are currently taking metabolic peptides, there's lots of things that we need to be mindful of along this journey. So how they're able to initiate and where they're accessing these medications. What is the plan while they're on this medication to keep them at the lowest effective dose? And really, what I see as the biggest gap with a lot of these metabolic peptides is what's the plan for afterwards? So, a common question that we often get in clinic is how long do I need to be off of this? And what happens when I come off? Because the biggest fear is that you have these massive metabolic health gains while you're on the metabolic peptide. And there's immense fear about how you maintain that once you're off of the metabolic peptide. So, we're going to really drill into this new tool called SiPore, what it is, how it works in the body, what the science is, because they've done things right. In when we think about supplements and metabolic tools and metabolic foods, they've gone from preclinical studies to their most recent clinical trial that was published in Lancet. So we'll go through the evidence story. And then we're going to talk about how this tool fits along the entire journey of your patients taking metabolic peptides. So let's dive in. This is a quick intro about me. I'm a naturopathic doctor based out of San Diego, California. So drop in the chat where you're joining us from today. I have been blessed to be at the intersection of education and clinical implementation. So both educating practitioners in this space and having the blessing of actually seeing patients in my clinical practice. And so I'm super excited to be able to translate the evidence for you all today about this new metabolic tool so that way you can bring this tool to your patients tomorrow morning. So let's set the scene here. This was a recent study, or really a survey that was taken late 2025 last year, if you haven't seen this headline. But what they found is out of 1,300 surveyed US adults, 1 in 8 adults is currently taking a metabolic peptide, specifically GLP-1, now that we know that there's dual and triple hormone metabolic peptide pharmaceuticals available, specifically for weight loss, diabetes, and another condition. So what this tells us is there's a lot of people on this metabolic peptide journey, which then brings us to the next question clinically is how are all of these individuals getting these medications? So this was actually a study that was published by JAMA just a month ago. And what they did is they actually created a simulated patient avatar and tested out 49 telehealth websites over a period of 4 months at the end of last year. And what they found is that there is a super low barrier for patients to access these metabolic peptides. So they had an approval rate among all of these telehealth websites of almost 92% of patients getting approved for these medications. And the turnaround time for them to get a prescription was less than a day. So there's not very many patients that would say no to a low barrier medication that helps them achieve their weight loss goals or metabolic health goals super easily, and they're able to get that prescription in less than a day. So now we have an idea of how easy it is to get these medications, which then begs the next question, well, what's being missed in this super high approval rate and super low barrier to accessing these metabolic peptides? So what's super interesting about this secret shopper study that JAMA did is that less than 30% of these telehealth websites actually required a live visit rate. And nearly two-thirds of those telehealth websites entirely relied on questionnaires to qualify someone for these metabolic peptides. And what they found about these questionnaires is it's a lot of leading questions. So they want people to be approved for these medications, which is great if it's clinically indicated and not so great if it's not as clinically indicated, which you can really only gather in, right, a really thorough history and a review of their medical history as well. Now, another interesting finding of the secret shopper study is that they highlighted several assessment gaps. So, given the fact that there's no clinician or healthcare provider actually screening these patients for starting metabolic peptides, there inadvertently were gaps that were not asked in these assessments. So, around 50% of these telehealth companies actually asked any questions about diet and exercise, which, as functional and longevity medicine clinicians, we know that that is absolutely a critical part to any comprehensive care plan when we talk about metabolic peptides. We also saw less than 40% of them actually requested any information about their clinical data as it relates to blood pressure, glucose, and lipids, which we know is part of the inclusion criteria for qualifying for getting these medications. So it raises some questions about who's getting missed there. And of course, less than 20% actually asked if the patient had an overseeing clinician. So if we think about how many patients are on GLP-1s, how easily they're able to access these metabolic peptides, and then the gaps in how these patients are being screened for starting this medication, we can start to think about how we can support these patients for making sure that they have this comprehensive care plan that involves diet, lifestyle, and a live clinician to actually oversee their care. So as you can tell, I'm a super curious person, which then makes me think, okay, well, what's happening once these patients that are not being overseen by a clinician, that don't have a comprehensive care plan, what can we think about their life, how their life might be in this post-GLP-1 era? So we have the studies from Step 1 and Surmount 4 that show that within that year of them discontinuing medications like semaglutide and tirzepatide, that many of those patients actually regain two-thirds of the weight that they lost within the first year. And that's associated with a return of those biomarkers that we saw improvements on while they were on the medication. So things like A1C, fasting glucose, blood pressure, lipids. And so that starts to make us think, okay, we really need to initiate all of our comprehensive care tools and plans really all along the metabolic peptide journey. So this was actually a marketing study that looked at over 150,000 US households and identified around 2,600 of them that had an active GLP-1 user in that household. And what they did is they actually looked at their purchasing behavior at grocery stores and restaurants while they were on the medication and while they were off the medication. So, as we could expect, while they're taking the medication, we saw a reduction in grocery spending, a reduction in dining out and fast foods, and we actually saw a reduction in the concentration of ultra-processed foods in what they were buying. So, all great movement in the needles that we typically want to move for these patients when we think about moving them closer towards metabolic health. Now, what's interesting when they discontinued this medication is in the year after, they actually saw these patients rebounded back to their baseline spending of grocery shopping and dining out, which is to be expected because their appetite is back, they're starting to eat more normally. But what was super interesting is in this post discontinuation era, they actually saw an increase in slightly less healthy foods. So this was used basically taking a picture and looking at the foods that were purchased at the grocery store and giving them a healthiness index based on how processed they were. And so what they saw is they actually saw a return of hyper palatable snacks. So this starts to kind of tinkle your spidey senses that we are missing a key mechanism in how these patients are actually solidifying and strengthening their lifestyle habits while they're on these metabolic peptides. So again, we know patients are on GLP-1s. We know that they have an easy time accessing them with not a lot of thought for the care plan throughout the metabolic peptide journey or afterwards. And now we can start to see this return in habits that we can suspect is associated with the return in rebound weight gain after they discontinue the metabolic peptide. So why is that concerning for clinicians that they're returning to these hyperpalatable foods, that they're not really maintaining these weight loss and metabolic health gains that they're were able to achieve while they're on the metabolic peptide? Well, we start to think about how that actually stresses out the body. And this isn't really all on the patient. This is really a larger problem with our larger food system. And we all know about the SAD diet, and which is really the modern day diet, and that it tastes really good. It gives us a lot of joy to eat it, and it doesn't give us a lot of satiety, which causes us to eat more. So it gives us this, puts us on this cycle of really eating more unhealthy food, which really causes this load of stress on our body to be able to process it, to be able to store it as fat, and make sure that we can keep up metabolically with this constant cycle of processed food. And so this really puts us on this journey of compounded choices towards metabolic stress and eventually metabolic disease. Now, many of our patients don't see us when they start eating unhealthy or when they start to experience, a metabolic stressor. They typically only see us when they're already at this final stage of metabolic disease, which begs the question, how do we actually buffer them from getting to that point? Hence SiPore. So we'll get into exactly what SiPore is, but really quickly, it's a meal level intervention that allows us to provide patients a tool to buffer their metabolic stress response to the modern diet. So provide some food flexibility, some food freedoms while they start to reinforce and strengthen those lifestyle habits without them getting the compounded effects of metabolic stressors that eventually lead to metabolic disease like type 2 diabetes, obesity, being overweight, cardiovascular disease, and the list goes on. So this is a visual representation. On the left is the cycle without SiPore. So this cycle of eating a modern diet, overloading your body with metabolic stressors, and eventually compounding towards metabolic disease. What we're really trying to do is provide a new tool called SiPore that helps to buffer against those metabolic stressors, help our patients buffer those stressors against the modern diet, and put them on a good cycle of healthy compounded habits, or I'm sorry, healthy habits that compound over time to actually lead them towards metabolic health. So a new positive cycle of how they can start to work towards their metabolic health goals. And so, what are the categories of tools that we're already currently working with? So, we're really good at lifestyle adaptation. We're really good at recommending diets, nutrition plans, movement plans. I know we've all kind of explored how we tell patients to order their foods, right? Eating fiber and fat and protein, and then carbs last. Encouraging movement after meals to help them utilize their glucose after meals. Encouraging regular exercise so that way they can start to increase muscle mass, And then we also start to get into other lifestyle recommendations around caloric restriction, fasting, and that expands to, right, sleep regulation, stress regulation, and whatnot. So the issue with lifestyle interventions is that it's super high effort on the patient and it's really difficult to sustain. And what I would say is buffer against life, right? We all go on vacation. We all have events where we can't be perfect with the lifestyle adaptation. So, albeit very effective and albeit still a foundational part of our recommendations, there's still gaps in how we can still support patients and how they're able to sustain even the lifestyle interventions. On the other side of the spectrum, we have systemic interventions, which are intended to override our biology and give our patients what I call a little extra oomph for the lifestyle interventions that they're already doing. So, this is really where supplements come in, like akkermansia, fiber, creatine, MyHMB, and berberine, and other things that are meant to enhance the biological mechanisms that will help enhance the response to the lifestyle intervention. So enhancing that insulin response, making sure that we can give them higher amounts of fiber so that way we can improve their gut microbiome, which helps with metabolic dysfunction. And then we also have surgical interventions such as bariatric surgery. So as you can imagine, this is not accessible for everyone for many reasons, and so leaves a gap in the spectrum of interventions that we currently have for managing metabolic health. So this is why we have SiPore as a new category of tools in your tool belt for how you support these patients. And again, this is a meal level intervention. It is non-systemic, so it stays local in the gut, which we'll dive into the mechanism in just a moment. And it is intended to buffer, right, our metabolic stress response to modern day food, specifically against carbs and fats. So we're going to drill into that science here. So what are we really doing? We are slowing down fast food. And this is a really key phrase that I learned from the SiPore team that I just absolutely love and my patients love too. And this is that really simple way to explain what we mean by buffering against metabolic stress or a metabolic stress response with modern day food. And really, the way that this works is we're slowing down the breakdown of carbs and fats, which therefore buffers our glucose response and fat metabolism once we absorb those nutrients. And that leads to staying fuller longer, eating less, reducing cravings, and ultimately stabilizing that blood sugar in the postprandial period, which is really what we is considered the metabolic stressor physiologically. So what is SiPore? So SiPore is a engineered silica particle. And what they've done on this silica particle, and I'm holding up this tiny little silica particle as if you could see it. But what they've done on this silica particle is they've actually engineered the perfect size pore on this tiny silica particle to selectively bind alpha amylase and lipase. So it doesn't bind to anything else except those two digestive enzymes. And what it does is because you're binding to those two enzymes, is it blocks the ability temporarily for those two enzymes to break down carbohydrates and fats. So that way you are more slowly absorbing those two macronutrients. So the way that you take it is you take it with your first bite of food. The SiPore particle entraps those two digestive enzymes with the carbohydrates and fats in your food. They have a slower breakdown in the body as they travel along the GI tract and therefore don't have as high of a glucose spike in the postprandial period. So we'll dive into some of the CGM responses because that is one of the best ways to see how you're buffering this glucose response. So what we typically call it, what I tell patients is it's a super expensive sand particle that has been specifically engineered to buffer your response against modern food and the metabolic stressors that it caused. So we're going to dive into this SHINE trial, which was just published in Lancet a couple months ago. But this is a super safe intervention. So because the silica particle has been specifically engineered, they've also engineered it to a size where it doesn't absorb systemically. So that's why I was talking about this gut localized mechanism. So again, already differentiates it from several of those other ends of the spectrum of lifestyle and overriding biology interventions that we just talked about. And we'll go into the studies that show that super high safety profile because it isn't systemically absorbed. Just as a reminder, silica is naturally found in a lot of foods. So this is a safe raw material that we're also starting with. If we go back to my naturopathic school days, we often talked about drinking horsetail tea as a source of silica and minerals for individuals that were deficient in some of those nutrients. And so, what is the history of how this was started? So, Professor Tori Bengtson was actually looking for a way to enhance our responses to food by modulating our enzyme breakdown of things like carbs and fats to specifically help patients who are pre-diabetic or had type 2 diabetes. And what he found, because he had this fascination with silica particles, is that you could actually engineer the silica particle to bind to the digestive enzymes and actually affect our response to food. And so this started in 2007, and through a series of preclinical and clinical trials, we ultimately ended up with the product SiPore today. So all of these studies are linked at the bottom of this presentation, but we're going to do an overview of the history of the evidence because I think it's super interesting, and it's very rare that we see products in our space actually do their due diligence to provide us all of this evidence. And so I want us all to be aware of what the science is behind this new tool. So, starting with preclinical studies, what they wanted to show is that can we get these perfectly engineered silica particles to actually bind to the enzymes that we want it to? So they were able to prove that in the in vitro studies that SiPore effectively bound to alpha amylase and lipase. Check. We have addressed the mechanism that we are trying to target for this patient population. Moving into animal studies, we wanted to start to glean, okay, what type of clinical outcomes can we start to think about for this particular therapy? So in the animal studies, particularly mice, they found that when taking the SiPore particle, we saw reductions in body weight and fat mass, which is exactly what we think about patients pursuing metabolic peptides for. It actually suppressed weight gain and fat tissue accumulation. And we actually started to see that glucose response mechanism that we'll hone into in these next few slides about lowering that postprandial blood lipid levels and blood glucose levels. So gave us an indication as to what the immediate felt experience might be for this particular therapy. Then we brought that into humans. So through a series of clinical trials leading up to their most recent clinical trial in the SHINE study, we wanted to prove that it was safe. So remember we mentioned that silica is naturally found in food, but given the fact that we were going to be giving this with every meal, we wanted to ensure that the silica wasn't just getting absorbed into the body and you would just accumulate all of these silica particles. So in that first in man study, we had a proven safety profile and that it was effective for individuals with obesity. And when I say effective, they showed significant reductions in A1C and LDL cholesterol. Now, that was, albeit a smaller study with 20 individuals. So that brought us to our next study, which is STAR. And so what they did is they expanded the inclusion criteria to those that had prediabetes, were newly diagnosed, or those with type 2 diabetes that hadn't started any drug therapy yet. And what they found is they also saw a reduction in hemoglobin A1C, and again, still safe and well tolerated. And by safe, meaning very few adverse effects and also not absorbing any of the silica particles, and also proving that it is a local mode of action. So moving through the postprandial study, and we'll hone in on this SHINE study here. So the SHINE study, quick things are, it featured 318 patients who had obesity or were overweight, diagnosed with prediabetes or newly diagnosed type 2 diabetes. And what they did is they took the SiPore liquid product, which is 3 grams of the SiPore product with each meal, so 3 times a day for 3 months. So SiPore liquid 3 times a day for 3 months. So the first outcome that they found, which is significant, is a significant reduction in hemoglobin A1C within 3 months. And if you look at this table here as we compare it to metformin, the the cool thing about what we find here is that we are actually seeing a greater reduction in hemoglobin A1C in a shorter period of time compared to metformin. So we were able to achieve a reduction of 0.9 nanomoles per mole in hemoglobin A1C in 3 months versus metformin, which is only a reduction in 0.6 nanomoles per mole within 6 months. So again, an intervention that works at mealtime, super easy to implement with faster and greater results than metformin, okay? And we're not seeing as many of the GI effects such as loose stools, nausea, or abdominal pain that we typically see as we start to initiate metformin in patients. So let's drill into some of these more specific metrics. So, body composition, a super important conversation as we think about patients along the metabolic peptide journey, right? We're super concerned about particularly losing visceral fat, maintaining or gaining lean muscle mass. And what we see with the SiPore results in the SHINE study is that we see reductions in body weight, which is great, but we care more about body composition. So we see reductions in visceral fat, which is that more inflammatory fat that contributes to metabolic dysfunction. We see an overall reduction in fat mass, and we actually see an increase in lean mass. So those are super valuable metrics that we encourage patients to be mindful of as they are on their metabolic peptide journey. We look at through the BIAs and DEXA scans, but we typically think about intervening to support those specific metrics with diet and lifestyle, right? Strength training, increasing protein, making sure that they're taking things like creatine to help support their muscle mass growth. And this aligns with some of their preclinical studies as well, where they saw reductions in body weight and body fat. So next step is let's hone in on the blood sugar and diabetes piece. And this is super interesting from the SHINE study as well. So we already saw these significant reductions in A1C in a shorter period of time than metformin. So we also saw that this was likely due to a reduction in blood sugar levels. And clinically, for the individual 318 individuals in this study, we saw fewer patients who had pre-diabetes progress to diabetes. So a preventative measure is what I would call it for those individuals to use SiPore at mealtime. Additionally, anybody with type 2 diabetes, twice as many participants who took SiPore liquid 3 times a day with meals reverted back to pre-diabetes if they had a type 2 diabetes diagnosis. So using this intervention actually helped them revert towards metabolic health or closer to metabolic health because they still had pre-diabetes, which is astounding, right? We didn't really change anything about their diet and lifestyle in this study. There were no recommendations made to change their current level of fitness. And yet, with one tool at mealtime, we saw less patients progress to diabetes and more patients revert back to pre-diabetes. So again, a proactive tool and also a tool to help patients revert back to metabolic health. Interesting takeaways for cardiovascular health because this SiPore particle also binds to lipase. We saw improvements in LDL cholesterol, which is supportive of, some of the cardiovascular benefits that we typically look for when we initiate metabolic peptides. And the mode of action was also an important takeaway from the SHINE study. So what we saw is that there's actually a reduction in glucose spikes after meals, and this was particularly with a potato starch solution versus an entire meal. And we can see that glucose spike is blunted. So we are now supporting that idea that we are actually slowing down the absorption of carbs, as evidenced by the fact that we're not getting that glucose spike after meals. So we're going to drill into this postprandial glucose response a little bit more because this is one of the easiest wins that you can give your patients, especially if they're wearing a continuous glucose monitor. So what we're really trying to achieve by curbing those glucose spikes when we think about the metrics that are tested on a CGM is we are encouraging more time in range. So not this glycemic variability where they're spiking super high and dipping and then eating another highly palatable food and spiking again. We want to try to stabilize that curve within the time in range that you have set for that patient. And so that is where SiPore absolutely shines. And what, no pun intended with the SHINE study. And what we see is when we're able to curb these glucose spikes and spend more time in range, that is the positive habit that compounds towards moving them closer to metabolic health and how we're able to think about achieving these clinical outcomes and improving hemoglobin A1C, fasting glucose, insulin resistance, fat mass, waist circumference, LDL cholesterol, visceral fat mass, and increasing lean muscle mass. So honing in on that CGM response, this was actually an example shared by the CEO of this company where he had a burger, so hard to say, not say the brand name, but I'm sure you could tell, a large burger with fries while taking SiPore. So the red line is him eating this burger and fries without SiPore. You can see this big spike up and then this big crash down. And what he did is had the exact same meal. The only difference was that he added SiPore liquid. And you can see here a significant reduction in that glucose spike, which spending again this entire time in range. And therefore, we don't see the crash afterwards. So, being the curious person that I am and wanting to make sure that you always try before you recommend to patients, I ran my own experiment. So, these screenshots are from a platform called Telehealth, which supplies medical grade CGM. So, this is with the Libre 3 sensor. I tried the exact same meal 2 days in a row, which is a turkey sandwich and some sweet potato chips. So, admittedly, this isn't the most unhealthy meal and it isn't a cheeseburger and fries. But the only difference is that I added SiPore on the right here. So, if we look at our key glucose values, we can see that my glucose at 75 minutes dropped by 11 points. Same thing at 90 minutes. It took me 1 hour less to stabilize my blood glucose, and my peak glucose was also 11 points lower. So you can see it slightly on the curve, but I think these metrics are slightly more important. So again, absolutely zero change in what I'm eating. The only thing that I added in was SiPore, and that's literally how easy it is. And what an easy win to not change anything and see this type of movement in your CGM metrics. So that encourages, right, patients to keep trying and keep making these positive lifestyle habits to compound towards achieving metabolic health. So I did another test with dinner, decided to add on dessert. I'll admit that it is coconut milk ice cream, and I put a bunch of nuts and chia seeds with my ice cream. So again, not the greatest example for fast food with using SiPore, but I think still a great indication for any of your longevity patients that are already doing this, that you can still move the needle when it comes to those CGM metrics and glucose response in the postprandial period. So again, taking a look at my peak glucose, 130 without SiPore, 119 just with adding SiPore liquid. Same thing with key glucose values at 75 and 90 minutes, significantly lower, especially at the 90-minute mark. Probably would be different if I didn't add in all the fiber and nuts and fats with this meal, but you can start to imagine how this would be more significant if we were to do a less healthy meal. So I use these slides to actually encourage patients to try it on themselves and get an easy win. For any individuals that don't want to use a CGM, the felt experience of SiPore is significant. So symptomatically, less bloating is what many patients report. They also don't get that like postprandial fatigue or crash after meals when taking SiPore. And most interestingly, we've seen some improvements in sleep scores if you have some late night eaters, because we're actually slowing down those absorption of carbs and fats, and so therefore not getting those glucose spikes while they're sleeping. So this is just an overview of what we're talking about here and how SiPore actually works. So we can see here on the left that this is where our patients are typically at before they start SiPore, where they're getting those post-meal metabolic stressors with glucose spikes, which contributes to early metabolic dysfunction. And by integrating SiPore into their journey, which we'll hone in on the GLP-1 specific or metabolic peptide journey in just a moment, we're able to stabilize those metabolic stressors and therefore lead to a more time in range and a more stable metabolic pattern, which compounds over time again to improving metabolic health outcomes. So, how can we think about this along the metabolic peptide journey? Well, we know that SiPore is easy to use, it's fast acting. It only binds to amylase and lipase. It's localized in the gut. And so, therefore, is a really great companion at every step of the way of the metabolic peptide journey. And so, when we think about the stages of a metabolic peptide journey, we think about qualifying the patient to make sure that they meet the eligibility criteria, unlike many online distributors. We think about that initiation period of actually starting them on the medication and getting them to their lowest effective dose. Then the maintenance period of them experiencing active weight loss at their magic dose and frequency, and then the off ramp and the tapering and the maintenance of those results. So at every stage of the metabolic peptide journey, SiPore is a good fit. And so, how is SiPore a good fit along each of these? Well, we talked about those gaps that patients are experiencing when they receive the metabolic peptides from these online online dispensaries. And so there's no one overseeing their care, no one's asking about diet and lifestyle, and they're also have no off-ramp plan. And so, really, just because SiPore works through a different mechanism, we're also not only filling the assessment gap to help them still pursue those lifestyle pieces, but we're also filling a physiologic gap. And that SiPore works completely different than metabolic peptides. So, we are really buffering the ability of digestive enzymes to break down carbs and fats to therefore slow their absorption into the body. So, completely different than a metabolic peptide, which is actually working both to slow the motility of your GI system so that way you feel fuller longer and therefore eat less, but it also affects your appetite centers and also improves insulin sensitivity, reduces inflammation. So, again, none of the mechanisms that metabolic peptides touch, SiPore fills that gap. We're also able to slow down fast food. So, when we think about patients and what they're eating while they're on metabolic peptides, this gives them an extra tool and an extra buffer for those days when they can't be perfect with diet while they're currently on the metabolic peptide. Additionally, once they come off of it, they don't necessarily have to have as much food or fear around being so strict with their diet because we're able to provide a mechanism that slows down their absorption of certain carbs and fats. Additionally, we're reinforcing the glycemic control that we are creating by being on the metabolic peptide. So, by curbing those glucose spikes, we don't require as much of an insulin response. So, again, reinforcing what the metabolic peptide is intended to do. And other mechanisms that we're supporting is satiety and meal structure. So, satiety is a super important piece of being on a metabolic peptide. And what often happens on a metabolic peptide is you're just shutting off food noise. So they're not really learning any habits about how to actually manage the food noise once they're off of the medication. SiPore works different in that it actually causes you to just slow down your absorption of food so that way you feel fuller longer, but you're still learning how to reinforce those habits alongside it. And it's not as severe because SiPore works with your biology at mealtime versus just flooding your system with a metabolic peptide for the entire week. Lastly, we added a layer of protection for cheat days. So I like to refer to this as food freedom for when you go on vacation, birthday parties, weddings, celebrations, treating yourself. This is the best tool for this. So I brought an entire case of SiPore with me to Hawaii on our recent family vacation. And Matt, who's on the call, also has a similar story. And I didn't want to stress about being super strict on the diet for 10 days when I knew that I'd probably feel pretty crappy after eating really freely on vacation. And so bringing SiPore with me actually added a level of peace in that I didn't have to really think about being super strict, but I also didn't have to stress about undoing all of the positive choices that I had made previously. And I could still work towards my metabolic health goals while I was on vacation. That level of freedom and peace is something that we rarely get to offer our patients because we're constantly asking them to change and swap things. And so I'm very appreciative to have a tool in my toolbox for patients that actually allows them more freedom, and more flexibility to fit with their lifestyle. So this is honing in a little bit more on some of those pain points throughout each of the stages of the metabolic peptide journey. So when we think about this initiation phase, we want to be mindful of side effects, specifically nausea. We want to be mindful of how strongly we're shutting down their food noise and their appetite. Are they still eating? And what are they eating when they are eating? And making sure that the patient doesn't immediately drop off with initiation. So how SiPore liquid fits during this phase is we're able to really buffer the food that the patient is eating during this initiation phase, so that way we can find their lowest effective dose and we can try to prevent them from getting any adverse effects that are strong enough to force them to discontinue. So it's an easier on-ramp onto the medication. Next stage of the metabolic peptide journey is active weight loss. So we start to think about how well are they protecting their muscle? Are they strength training? Are they eating enough protein? Are they experiencing any plateaus at that certain dose? Are we constantly escalating the dose because the patient experiences benefits in their appetite and weight management, but then plateaus and we need to bump up their dose? And then we also think about the occasional glucose spikes that may be caught on a continuous glucose monitor during this time because they're being a little bit less strict in what they're eating because they're eating less. So they feel like they can get away with eating less healthy meals. And this is without clinician supervision. SiPore fits perfectly during this active phase. We already saw in the SHINE study that we saw improvements in lean muscle mass, we saw reductions in visceral adiposity, and by curbing those glucose spikes and helping to enhance satiety mechanisms, we can potentially prevent the consistent dose escalation that many patients experience because they're plateauing and want to maintain their ability to suppress their appetite and weight loss. This kind of transfers into maintenance phase where patients are on these metabolic peptides for a long time and where they're constantly using these metabolic peptides to curb their appetite and maintain their weight loss. That's when we start to be worried about nutrition gaps. And so, what I always counsel patients on is we want to keep you at the lowest effective dose for the shortest period time possible and make sure that you strengthen the lifestyle foundations so that way we can take you off of it. So, this maintenance phase is really for my patients that may have some genetic predispositions to being slightly resistant to the peptides. So, do they have a tendency to just put on a lot of visceral adipose tissue? They have a tendency to not put on a lot of muscle mass. They have some genetic predispositions to developing diabetes and cardiovascular disease dysfunction, cardiovascular disease. Those are the patients that we want to be really mindful of how we're supporting their diet and lifestyle while they're on these metabolic peptides long term. SiPore is a way for us to maintain them at not the highest dose, so that way they have another tool in their toolbox. And then lastly, what I would consider the most important part of the metabolic peptide journey is the post-metabolic peptide era, how we actually get patients off of these medications and help them sustain their goals that they were able to achieve while on the metabolic peptide. So avoiding things like weight regain, relapse in eating habits, and making sure that, if patients are not able to access these metabolic peptides any longer, that we give them another tool to still get a lot of those similar outcomes that we're hoping to achieve with the metabolic peptides in regards to weight loss, lowering visceral adipose tissue, lowering LDL cholesterol, curbing glucose spikes, and maintaining lean muscle mass. Again, all of those clinical outcomes that were in the SHINE study can be used during this offboarding period. So what that actually looks like clinically is when patients are thinking about starting a metabolic peptide, we will instantly talk about SiPore to say, why don't you not change anything about your diet and lifestyle that we are already doing, right? We're already talking about ordering your foods, increasing protein, enhancing strength and resistance training. Let's just add SiPore into the mix. If they're open to it, we will likely do a CGM just so they can get the easy win of seeing how nothing changes in their lifestyle and they're already making changes in their metabolic response. Super easy win. I have some patients that will stay on SiPore and that will still feel pretty strongly that they want to move forward with the metabolic peptide. As they initiate the peptide, we're still taking SiPore liquid with every meal, but we are mindful about when they're eating meals. So often, as we're initiating a metabolic peptide, they will likely eat less. That may change how often you recommend the SiPore liquid. And we're keeping a really close eye on what they're eating and what their habits are to really determine when we need to escalate their dose or when we can hold them. And then with the off ramp, as we're slowly titrating them down, we're watching how their eating habits, satiety, cravings, energy is changing as we're taking them off of the metabolic peptide. And again, keeping SiPore woven in throughout that entire process to really not only buffer the metabolic stressors of the foods that they start to integrate as they come off of the peptide, as their appetite returns, but also to ensure that we can taper them more slowly. And that way they can completely offboard with confidence that they're able to sustain these habit changes that they were able to achieve. So there's two forms of SiPore liquid, which are the capsules. I'm sorry, of SiPore. There is the capsules and the liquid. So capsules, we typically recommend 4 capsules per day, which is 2 per meal. I will tell you, I have seen the needle move the most with the SiPore liquid. So it has a slightly citrusy taste. They're in little liquid sachets. You can put them in your purse, keep them at the office, bring them with you on vacation, bring it with you to dinner, and it's just one of those liquid sachets per meal, so 3 of those per day. You can see that the dose is significantly different between the capsules and the liquid. Clinically and personally, I just find the best response with the liquid. And so it's easiest for my patients to just remember to take one of those per meal, and it's really easy to travel with. And I have a lot of patients that are so sick of taking capsules that they are so excited to take something other than another capsule and are super eager to take the liquid. If you are interested in learning more, Matt is on this call. He is absolutely wonderful, can help you set up a practitioner account, but there's several channels to actually access these products. And if you are interested in creating a wholesale account or connecting with Matt, go ahead and scan these QR codes. Um, I am so grateful to have spent this time with you all and look forward to answering some questions.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much. Looks like Matt's been in the chat
Oh,
answering
awesome.
questions, which is good. So, Matt, you can also put the link in for a wholesale account into the chat if you want. Can you put the QR code back up again
Oh,
first,
yeah.
Alex? Thank you much.
Mhm.
Very fast. I was like, whoa, hold on. I didn't even get my camera open.
Yeah.
From Gen X. Give me a
I feel
minute.
like
Yeah, I
time
still get,
moves quite different when you're like recording a webinar. So that was probably me thinking a minute had passed.
I'm still the one that goes to Safari to look up things on YouTube on my
Yeah.
phone.
Yeah.
So some questions, let's just go through just to make sure. Also, remember, if you have a Get Healthy store, this is available in your catalog. Add it today because you're going to want to implement this clinical strategy in. I assume we could get some protocol copies for our practitioners that attended. Also, your account managers are on this webinar as well. So Andy and Candace are in the chat. If you have any questions, you want to set up a call with them on how to build a bundle, how to build a blueprint utilizing SiPore, and how to interject that into your clinical practice. So this was extremely informative. Just a few questions that I have, if there aren't any, because Matt already answered one. Megan asked, "What does it taste like?" I think you said it was citrusy.
Yeah, it's got a light citrusy taste. Other than that, it's fairly neutral. So the feedback that I get from patients is a little citrusy, a tinge bit sour, but ultimately neutral. It's kind of like those goo packets that you eat if you do any endurance sports, but not nearly as sugary or syrupy.
Okay. Yeah, so I think you talked a lot about the science, the way the action works within the body. I think one of the other things to approach that we get is, with the use of injectables, whether it's a metabolic peptide or a different one, the injection, the cost and the compliancy starts to fall, which is you address kind of like 50% will fall off. And I think, they're going to become less accessible, and I think it's something to talk about. A lot of people that are using these GLP-1s aren't always going to a telehealth service. They're going online. They're
Mhm.
buying it off a company, going to Amazon, buying bacteria water and getting syringes.
Yep.
So there's no instructions, there's no guidance, there's nothing. And I think that's why, people are having issues because they don't know how to start, how to maintain, and how to wean. Uh,
Hmm.
so that's a big part of the conversation, when people are walking in the door of sourcing peptides, guided experience. I was shocked to see that 98%, did you say, of people just went to a telehealth access company and got access? Like
Yeah,
that's
92% approval rate for the simulated patient avatar that pursued getting a GLP-1 prescription from 49 telehealth companies, which is, and nearly two-thirds of that was approved only using a questionnaire, which, as you know, there's only so much that you can get from a questionnaire. And when you actually drill into some of these questionnaires on these telehealth companies, they're leading questions, right? They're not these neutral medical questionnaires that we typically think about in a visit. It's very much so encouraging the patient to think about and answering yes to a lot of these eligibility criteria, so that way they're more likely to get approved for the medication. So scary, really, to think about.
it's pretty scary. So the mechanism of how this traps the digestive enzymes, right? So in
Mhm.
my mind, that potentially changes where and when the nutrients are exposed to the intestine. Have you found that it affects any type of gastro issues with people that take it? Is it make a difference if someone has a gallbladder or doesn't have a gallbladder?
Yeah, so we'll take those in pieces. So, in the clinical studies and in the SHINE trial, they found that there was no change in absorption of vitamins and minerals. So, that's a super common question that we get is, well, if you're, preventing the breakdown of carbs and fats, does that prevent the breakdown of some of the good stuff that I actually want to absorb? They didn't find that there were any changes in vitamin and nutrient of mineral levels with taking the SiPore liquid at 3 grams 3 times per day for 3 months. For the gastro issues, this is something that they're actually drilling into. So, what they found is they actually found that there's a positive effect on the gut microbiome when taking SiPore liquid at that assigned dose in the SHINE trial. And the reason for that being is it's a similar mechanism to what we think about with indigestible fiber, and that it's not getting absorbed, but then you're having these undigested fibers that are now feeding your good bacteria in the colon. And so, out of all of the adverse effects, which were very minimal, maybe a little bit of digestive upset and a little bit of bloating, but really, clinically, I see the opposite. I actually see reductions in bloating postprandially. And I know that there were lots of questions on previous webinars about like how does this affect patients with SIBO and bacterial overgrowth that we don't actually want to encourage the growth of those microbes. And so they're drilling into some of those more gut-specific biomarkers in the SHINE study. So looking at what is the production of short chain fatty acids, what exactly is happening to the microbial terrain when taking SiPore. So I would say to be determined with these follow-up look at the SHINE trial results. And then for the patients that have a gallbladder versus don't have a gallbladder, they don't have any studies currently to really show if there's an impact or difference in response for those two patient populations. So I don't have any evidence to really answer that question at this time, but I'm sure that will come up as more and more people start to use this particular tool.
Yeah, and I mean, I know that there's brands that I work with that love the observational trial too, to
Yep.
give back on it, So I think the more people that apply it clinically, the more information you can get back and make adjustments for specialty groups or people that have some sort of compromise. So, GLP-1 or metabolic peptides, they don't just stay within the weight loss spectrum, obesity and pancreatic action. I think there's a lot of other benefits. Do you see that with SiPore? I mean, I saw the reduction in cholesterol, which I thought was pretty amazing. Cardiovascular risk, liver metabolism, any kidney outcomes, the neurometabolic signaling, like, is any of that been addressed, studied, or isn't that in the future of using this?
I would say it's in the future of using this. They don't have those endpoints outlined in the current studies, and mainly because that trial was only 3 months long, right? So we're starting to see the beginning metabolic effects that lead to those some other endpoints of improvements in cardiovascular disease. With weight loss, we can see improvements in obstructive sleep apnea. And really, right, by curbing the glucose spikes, I'm super excited about my patients that have MASH or metabolic associated steatotic liver disease, because that is really the trigger for how that comes about, right? And if we can reverse that cycle, super important mechanism to be mindful of, and I think will be important studies to look for in the future. One of the things that comes up clinically is, and a question that I had with Matt when we first started working with them is like, can this help patients that are on a keto diet, right? Maintain ketosis if we're curbing the absorption of glucose. So I've been pushing to try to test that in some of my patients, but don't have the evidence to support that as of today.
Yeah, because you may think it might knock glucose too low, but really the body's pretty smart. I think it offsets a lot of things. So, well, this has been extremely informative. Thank you. And thanks, Matt, for being in the chat, answering the questions. Don't forget to add this to your Get Healthy store. It is available and ready to go. Connect with your account manager. And if you don't have a Get Healthy store, you can get a free demo by going to our website, or you can get on Get Healthy Script, which is our free version of a dispensary platform. So one box is a week's supply, Megan's question.
So the SiPore liquid box contains 21 sachets. So yes, if you take it 3 times per day, then that would be 1 week's worth. I will say clinical pearl, just from my patients and my personal experience, I'm a very distracted eater. So I'll eat a little something, get distracted with emails or a meeting and come back to a meal. it's best taken with the first bite of food. So if you have patients that tend to eat like that and are like, I'm still getting these glucose spikes while taking the SiPore liquid, sometimes I'll have them do half and half. So take half of the liquid with your first bite of food. If you get distracted, take the second half of the liquid sachet with when you finish your meal. A little bit more flexibility with the capsules if you just know that you're that type of eater, but are able to stretch out that box a little bit more, especially if like you're only having a smoothie for breakfast, but having more carb and fat heavy meals for lunch and dinner. You would probably only need SiPore. I would only recommend SiPore for those meals that you're actually eating. Doesn't work as well for like liquid carbs, so it doesn't work if you take it with like a soda or anything. So just a couple pearls there for if you were using the liquid or the capsules.
Well, thank you, Dr. Lexi. This has been incredible. Guys, thanks for joining us today, and we will see you on our next webinar. Don't forget to get your wholesale account and also add it to your Get Healthy store. Have a
Thank you
great
so much.